and welcome to the People's Platform. My guest tonight is a globally renowned international women's human rights expert serving on the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania and as visiting faculty at Harvard and Oxford. She has held senior advisory roles with the UN, World Bank and global governments on women's rights, peace and justice. Her widely published scholarship spans international women's human rights, legal reform and technology-facilitated gender-based violence. She also serves as the Vice Chair on the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute and is on the Advisory Council to the President of the UN General Assembly. She was elected to serve as an expert member on the treaty body to the UN Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, and serves as the focal point on women, peace and security. Professor Rangita de Silva de Alwis, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you, Sonali, for having me, and congratulations on all your achievements.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Professor, it's lovely to have you here in Sri Lanka and at the Newsfirst studio. Now, CEDAW marks the 25th anniversary of its Women, Peace and Security agenda. Last year, you were requested to develop an addendum to CEDAW's General Recommendation 30 on women in conflict prevention, conflict and post-conflict situations. I've had the opportunity of glancing through the advanced, unedited version of the addendum. Now, since the launch of GR30, the landscape of conflict has evolved, and we see this through the changing nature of warfare, shrinking civic space, etc. Take us through this shifting landscape and the implications it has.
Sonali, I'm glad that you've had the opportunity to peel back some of the layers of the advanced unedited copy of the addendum to the GR30, which also serves as our own normative framework for the Women, Peace and Security agenda, which was launched in the year 2000. And we are right now at the cusp of celebrating and marking the 25th anniversary of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And so we are at this inflection point in the history of the world and at this critical cutting edge moment for both the CEDAW and the WPS agenda to look at the ways in which the evolutions and the changing face of conflict has created a new momentum and a new understanding and a fresh exploration of international law, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law, so as to address the evolution of conflict, the changing face of conflict through the prism of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So as you can understand from the peek sneak that you had from examining the advanced unedited copy of the GR30's addendum, that I start with an examination of the ways in which conflict has changed, but our understanding of the WPS agenda itself has changed. The WPS agenda was situated on three principles. The principles were threefold, as I said, and one was the prevention of conflict, the participation of women in conflict resolution and peace building, and the protection of women during and in the aftermath of conflict. However, what we saw in the last 25 years is that there was a greater focus on the principle of protection of women during conflict. And what I call for is a shift in that lens towards the prevention of conflict, women's involvement in the prevention of conflict, and women's participation and leadership in not only addressing conflict resolution, but in preventing and ensuring that the root causes that led to the conflict in the first place are addressed through a feminist lens. So that is the premise on which I start. And then I go on to look at the ways in which a survivor-centric approach to justice is a cornerstone of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, not only in the Security Council Resolution 1325, but in Security Council Resolution 1820 and 2467, which calls for not only women's access to justice, but to situate women as central to the justice system. And once again, we are looking at the ways in which women's access to justice needs to be survivor-centric and not victim-centric, and to shift the stigma and the shame of sexual violence from the victim or the survivor of violence to the perpetrator, and to ensure that not only is there a categorical prevention and prohibition against sexual violence in conflict, but zero tolerance of sexual violence in conflict, and that women survivors of gender-based violence in conflict and their narratives of surviving conflict and their access to not only justice but to reparations have central focus in this new narrative of justice.
Professor, advances in AI are already transforming warfare. Cyberspace has become the new battlefield. At the same time, the digital gender divide continues to marginalize women from critical decision-making roles.
I start with the premise that women's bodies are not the only battlegrounds of conflict, that women's minds are the new battlegrounds of conflict. And we see that in the denial of education for women in places such as Afghanistan. So what we see is that education has been weaponized as a tool of conflict, and the ways in which women's empowerment and women's intellectual participation in conflict resolution needs to be understood as a security issue. And coming to the issue of technology and the cyberspace as this new space of conflict, what we see is that in many instances that well, not only is cyberspace a new space for conflict, but we see cyber attacks, cyber crimes, technology-facilitated gender-based violence, and other forms of gender-based violence that involve coded violence, digital violence, are being used as forms of weapons in conflict. And I also look at very specifically AI-driven lethal autonomous weapons systems as what the Secretary General has called morally repugnant, especially those AI-driven lethal autonomous weapons systems that are not consistent with international humanitarian laws, three major principles, and the principle of distinction. The need for weapons and weapons of war to be able to distinguish between combatants and civilians. And the kind of questions and challenges regarding how AI-driven lethal autonomous weapon systems that are not human-centric are able to make that distinction between combatants and civilians. And second, the principle of proportionality. Would AI-driven lethal autonomous weapon systems be able to make that judgment call on whether the attacks are proportionate to the perpetrator's attacks, whether any attack based on self-defense would be proportionate to the defense of self-defense. And thirdly, whether this would be proportionate. And in that proportionality context, we have to look at whether it is proportionate and whether these attacks against any enemy combatants would affect disproportionately not only civilian populations, but all other institutions that are considered outside of the realm of war, such as places of worship, such as hospitals, medical institutions, and educational institutions. And finally, the Martens Clause, which is the principles of humanity and of public conscience. So would AI be able to bring that essence, that degree of empathy Can we train large language models, and can we, the data that is being used to train large language models, as you know well, is shaped by historical data biases. And because of the historic biases in the data, and these biases are based both on race, gender, ethnicity, and religion, we know that these biases can spill over and bleed into and get baked into these large language models that drive innovations, so-called innovations in AI-driven lethal autonomous weapons. So the Secretary General has called for a legally binding instrument, and he has called for nation states, member states of the United Nations, to negotiate on a legally binding instrument. So I have called for, in this addendum, a feminist and a CEDAW-centric approach to that negotiations. And there are many countries, Fiji, Ireland, who have called for a gender perspective and to call for the ways in which lethal autonomous weapon systems can disproportionately impact women and girls and children, because women, girls, and children are not involved in the decision making regarding lethal autonomous weapon systems. So given the fact that women are absent, conspicuously absent in the decision making regarding AI-driven lethal autonomous weapon systems, that it is more likely that AI-driven what are called laws will have a disproportionate impact on women and girls. So it is both a call for women's participation in the negotiations and a feminist and a CEDAW-centric approach to these negotiations. And I'm very proud that Sri Lanka has co-sponsored a General Assembly resolution along with Austria, calling for the support of the Secretary General's call for a new, for the negotiation of a new legally binding instrument.
Professor, the world as we know it is at war, and we bear witness to the manner in which established legal principles under domestic law, under international humanitarian law, international human rights law, refugee law, criminal law are being flagrantly flouted and violated, where there is absolutely no accountability, there is absolute impunity, where the perpetrators are the global superpowers who act without any sort of restraint. How must we make sense of this?
So the Women, Peace and Security Agenda and the new addendum that is yet unedited and does look at the ways in which food insecurity, the weaponizing of starvation can be crimes against humanity if there is intention and intentionality for the deliberate impediments to access to humanitarian aid. So international humanitarian law, and to put it as simply as I can without being too technical, calls for the unimpeded access to humanitarian aid, as well as unimpeded access to objects that are indispensable to survival. And we have argued at the CEDAW that these objects that are indispensable to survival also include reproductive health, as well as menstrual products for women and girls. Because when we think of, when we look at the contours of humanitarian aid and what is indispensable for survival, we don't always bring a feminist lens. We don't always bring a CEDAW perspective or a prism to address this. So reproductive health, menstrual equity should be part of the critical need for unimpeded access to humanitarian aid, as well as what is indispensable for survival. And as for starvation, famine, and food insecurity, they are both the ICC as well as international humanitarian law, and now this new addendum does construct those principles as having the potential, rising to the level of crimes against humanity, rising to the level of crimes against humanity. And, if I have one more minute to explain this, we also see a confluence of other factors that I examine in the unedited advanced copy of the addendum, which is small arms and light weapons, the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons, and conflict minerals. So there is this confluence of small arms, light weapons, the ATT, which is the Arms Trade Treaty, and how compliance with the Arms Trade Treaty and the ways in which international law prohibits the illicit trade in small arms, light weapons need to be brought into the equation of the women, peace and security agenda. There is no longer room to create this distinction between WPS, the WPS agenda and international humanitarian law. We really need to bring them together at this moment of crisis in the world.
Professor, you draw reference to the importance of addressing conflict-related sexual violence. Women's bodies are often used as weapons in conflict, and we see how women are also excluded from legal remedies. We also see how women are reduced to victims. Their dignity, their identity as persons who can contribute to justice, to solutions, is completely ignored. We see this across jurisdictions. Speak to us about how we can look to resolution of this.
Absolutely, Sonali. And again, in the addendum, I start with the survivor-centric justice approach, that survivors need to be central to justice, but also their narratives need to be the stories that shape access to justice as well as remedies and reparations. And if we bring that survivor-centric approach to justice, we are more likely to come up with remedies and reparations that really address the root cause of the conflict. And I have argued, using the principles of reparation, that reparations not only involve direct harm, but moral harm, what is called a new category of harm, moral harm, which is the attacks on women's dignity. And that moral harm is very difficult because it's such a kind of amorphous concept. It is difficult to measure. But the ICC, in several new cases, including the Ongwen case, have articulated and constructed this concept of moral damage and intergenerational damage, that the attacks on women and sexual violence against women, as you said, women's bodies are sites of violence, sites of conflict, but it doesn't stop at a woman's body. It has intergenerational harm, transgenerational harm, that trauma, that psychological trauma, that emotional trauma continues to shape generations to come. So how do we measure the damage that is done? Through this transgenerational approach to reparations, including moral damage, physical damage, as well as reparations that look at institutional and structural changes, whether it be reforms in education, reforms in the justice system, reforms in the structures that were the root causes of the conflict. So I often quote the Zeppo Zarco case in Guatemala, which is a paradigmatic case of a victim-centered approach, where these indigenous women for many, many generations suffered the indignity of sexual slavery. And finally, because of the community support, so it's very much a very contextualized, holistic approach to justice, that NGOs, journalists like you, help to support the women to tell their stories and to come forward to the court to tell their stories in their own vernacular. And so that the justice system doesn't alienate either these women or their voices or their narratives. So storytelling is very important. And the justice system's role is to amplify those stories and to create an enabling environment that helps these women tell their stories in the way they feel the most comfortable, in a victim-centered, survivor-centric manner. And then again, what you talked about, that shift from victimhood to survivorhood, is that these women are the chief protagonists of the journey to justice. And it is their stories and their voices that shape it. It is not a superimposed narrative that is constructed by those outside of their own story.
Professor Rangita, in the addendum, it says that a study by the World Bank on 44 countries reveals that 49% of women who are victims of violence never sought help to stop violence and never told anyone. Women carry the shame and stigma and burden of violence that has been perpetrated against them. You speak about the importance of shifting this shame and stigma to the perpetrator. Elucidate this for us.
So Security Council Resolution 2467, which is part of the constellation of Security Council resolutions that are part of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, speaks about women's access to justice. But as I have mentioned in the addendum, that a majority of women do not seek justice for several reasons. One is the veil of impunity that shrouds the justice system, that access to justice does not always result in remedies or reparations. And secondly is the shame and stigma that shadows women's lives and the heavy burden that they carry, that somehow that women are to blame. And that shifting happens when the justice system completely disavows impunity, and when the community itself holds themselves or itself responsible and accountable to the violence and the conflict. And that creates a situation where we see the shift gradually taking place, that the shame is on the community, that to a large part was responsible, whether it is lack of state responsibility or lack of due diligence by even business partners, that to a large extent was inactive in preventing this violence, that the community, the justice system must take the blame. So it is shifting the shame and stigma to the perpetrator, but also shifting the responsibility to rehabilitate, to rectify, compensate, and reinstitute these women, not only in a status quo situation, but to ensure that their lives can go on, and the ways in which their stories will make a difference, both in the history of the nation, both in rebuilding of post-conflict ecosystems, but also in terms of how these narratives can help shape new constitutional reforms, new legislative reforms, new institutional reforms, and create a new narrative for the nation state.
We also saw how the ICC recently issued arrest warrants against the Supreme Leader of the Taliban, which represents, incidentally, the first time that the prosecutor has charged the crime of persecution on gender grounds on its own. This is really interesting, Professor. Speak to us about how significant this shift is.
Absolutely. So my friends and I have written at length and with great depth and breadth about this issue in the Columbia Transnational Law Journal. I've also written about it in the Cambridge Law Journal, but I also, at the most recent CEDAW review, which was an exceptional review of Afghanistan's report, and this was again an exceptional review because those reporting were the leaders of civil society and the women in exile and the embassy, in Geneva that is in exile. And one of the issues I raised was that the ICC's arrest warrants really constitute a remarkable change in the history of women's rights and in international law, because it is for the first time that the ICC's charges on persecution rest only on grounds of gender. There have been other charges brought on gender persecution, but they have always been brought as a bundle on the crimes against humanity. But here, this is the only charge. The charge of persecution on the grounds of gender is the only charge. And this really is remarkable and a shift, a turning point in the history of international law, international criminal law, and women's justice. The fact that that crimes against women and that gender persecution can be a standalone crime is remarkable. This is, of course, well past time, but the very fact that this is now being constructed by the ICC as a standalone charge against the perpetrators of gender persecution in Afghanistan is remarkable. And I spoke about how these crimes constitute gender persecution, starting from the ways in which public flogging, the public beating of women constitute clear persecution on the grounds of gender, but also denial, the whole-scale denial of girls' education, girls' and women's education from 6th grade onwards constitute persecution on the grounds of gender, and the ways in which the silencing of women, the muffling of women's voices, both in the public as well as in the intimate sphere, constitutes a form of persecution based on gender. The ways in which women have disappeared from the public sphere, both in terms of women's access to economic participation, political participation, or women's engagement in the public square, women's access to parks and recreations and gyms and restaurants and beauty salons, women's access to travel, and the right to freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, freedom of speech has been eroded and nullified by the 100-odd edicts that have been passed by the Taliban high commanders, constitutes gender-based persecution. But I also would like to go further, because we are also at a time when the ILC, the International Law Commission, is drafting a new Crimes Against Humanity treaty. And state parties and member states are coming together to create new reforms on crimes against humanity, and many countries have made recommendations that are very gender sensitive, including the possibility of a new legal construct that may amount to, and I'm being very cautious because as lawyers we're very cautious about these newly expanding areas of the law, that might name a new crime of gender apartheid.
We are in conversation with Professor Rangita de Silva de Alwis. We're going for a short commercial break. We'll be right back.
Chamatkara, an enchanting night awaits. A tribute to timeless legends, a celebration of melodies that echo through generations. A heartfelt homage to two icons who defined the soundscape of a nation. Victor Ratnayakar and Priya Suryasena. Their songs shaped our stories. Their voices touched our souls.
Join us for a night of unforgettable performances by Nalin Pereira, Samitha Mudunkotua. Sanka Dine. Raini Charuka. Nadimal Pereira. Lakshita Suryasena. Irushi Suryasena.
Chamatkara Rathriya, where legends live again. Musical direction by the brilliant Mahesh Nenipitiya. Every note will carry the soul of a legend. Mark your calendars for the 2nd of August from 6:30 p.m. onwards at the Muses College Auditorium. Tickets via theticketsministry.com. Don't miss the most heart-touching musical event of the year. Chamatkara Rathriya.
Welcome back. I'm in conversation with Professor Rangita de Silva de Alwis. She was, among her many roles, elected to serve as an expert member on the treaty body to the UN Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, and serves as the focal point on women, peace and security. Professor, Sri Lanka ratified CEDAW as far back as 1981. Now, our constitution enshrines the principle of equality. Most recently, in 2024, Sri Lanka enacted the landmark Women's Empowerment Act, which had as one of its objectives to develop mechanisms to ensure compliance with CEDAW. My question to you is, there's a disconnect between policy implementation and political realities.
Thank you, Sonali. This is a very important question, and a question that is not limited only to Sri Lanka. It is a question that we ask every state party to the convention, and one that requires that the full promise of the CEDAW can only be met if there is full transformation of the CEDAW into national and local practice. And that translation of the CEDAW into the vernacular is key to meeting the full obligations and that are enshrined in the CEDAW. So in terms of Sri Lanka's own obligations to ensure that translation and the transformative process of domesticating the CEDAW, it is important that that government is the first the government needs to be the one most responsible to the accountability mechanisms of the CEDAW. But the government is not the only responsible party. And we have expanded the ecosystem to engage with private actors, including the private sector and businesses under the due diligence principles, that they are responsible for the application of due diligence principles, and the fact that the lack of action taken to address the guarantees under the CEDAW creates responsibility on the part of private actors, including businesses. So I think, I would like a clarion call to all businesses and those who are private actors to also know that the CEDAW applies to you. That, of course, the government is the first and primary accountability source, but it does not stop with the government or with state actors. It also extends to non-state parties, including businesses and the private sector. It also, of course, includes the mobilizing and the galvanizing of civil society partners, including non-governmental organizations, journalists such as you, and all actors and stakeholders to whom the CEDAW applies. So it is key at this moment in time, especially at a time when Sri Lanka is coming out of not only conflict, but also several crises, such as the economic crisis, public health crises, and so many, and a climate emergency, which is ongoing, that we harness all available mechanisms to address the accountability process under the CEDAW Treaty, but also the ways in which the translation can occur. And I'm going to address two major issues at this moment in time. The ICJ just released its advisory opinion on climate justice, which is once again historic. Again, we see this major, efflorescence of international law principles at this critical moment in time. And I'm very proud that Sri Lanka was part of the over 100 state parties who sought an advisory opinion from the ICJ on climate accountability, to hold those CO2 emitters, the ones who are the most responsible for CO2 emissions, responsible and accountable for the climate crisis. And just 2 days ago, the ICJ's advisory opinion did create this responsibility accountability mechanism, but it does not still abdicate the responsibility of state parties, including Sri Lanka, to address climate mitigation and climate adaptation, and to see climate mitigation and adaptation through a feminist and CEDAW lens. Because I'm very proud that for the first time in the history of the International Court of Justice, the World Court invoked the CEDAW's GR 37 on climate justice and the climate emergency, but also disaster reduction. We are a country that still sees the scars of the tsunami. And disaster reduction, disaster mitigation must be seen through a feminist lens. The disproportionate impact of natural disasters on women, man-made disasters on women, and the ways in which women need to be in a leadership position under General Recommendation 40, which calls for women's equal participation. The parity representation of women in all leadership and decision-making, including in addressing the climate crisis. So I'm very glad that Sri Lanka has taken a leadership position, but I want this to continue in climate mitigation and climate adaptation, especially at a time when major leaders in the world are abdicating their responsibilities under the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC. When many countries have reneged on them, rolled back their obligations under the Paris Agreement, countries such as Sri Lanka, who are badly affected by the emitting countries, need to be at the forefront of addressing these issues and strengthening and building on multilateralism and a rules-based global order.
Professor, among CEDAW's recent concluding observations on Sri Lanka were the issue of criminalization of abortion in the instances of rape, incest, fetal abnormalities, the contradictions between the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act vis-a-vis domestic law and international human rights treaties, the non-criminalization of marital rape. These were only a handful of issues which were taken up.
You've underscored some of the key issues that were raised in the concluding observations to Sri Lanka. And it is very important that the government and civil society and all stakeholders take these concluding observations seriously and work towards realizing the recommendations that were made by the treaty body to the Sri Lankan government. And I think there is genuine interest and genuine concerns about the issues that were raised. And I think I laud the government, I laud civil society for taking this seriously and holding themselves accountable to the gaps in the implementation of the CEDAW. You spoke about the MMDA, and I just wanted to also share with you that many countries are governed by religious laws, and that personal status laws are based on religious or cultural traditions. And in our recommendations to these nation states, we have always said that there are good practices in many countries that can be followed, and that if there are good practices, let's say in Morocco, which did revise its mudawana, personal status laws, on a more gender equal basis, so can other countries. And so it is important that we use countries that are not only good practices but have similar cultural, traditional alliances that we can always follow. And with the MMDA, it is important that we bring all stakeholders, including women, to the table to build that consensus and to have continuous dialogues on the reform of the MMDA as a benefit to the women and the girls who are governed by these personal status laws, so that these women and girls whose contributions have made enormous changes to our country and to the world are able to meet the full promise of their potential and are not being held back by laws that impede that realization of their promise. And so you talked about the MMDA, you also talked about the Gender Empowerment Act, the Women's Empowerment Act, and another major issue, I think that was also underscored in the CEDAW's concluding observations, was cyber violence, and that cyber violence is impeding women's full participation in public life and in political life. And the Human Rights Commission, which also wrote a report to the CEDAW, underscored that several honorable members of parliament had experienced and were victims of cyber attacks, which not only threatened their careers in politics and in public life, but had the impact of deplatforming women in political and public life. And it is, but I've spoken about it, in a major talk 2 days ago at the California University, that in many countries what we see is that cyber attacks target not only women, but women in journalism, women human rights defenders, but women in political and public participation because of their voice, because their voice can threaten existing status quo and existing patriarchy.
Professor, the UK's Department for Education last week said misogynistic attitudes had reached epidemic scale among young people, fueled by internet influencers and harmful online communities. English schools will begin teaching students how to recognize and resist misogynistic content online in response to growing concerns over the influence of so-called manosphere figures like Andrew Tate. The new lessons aimed at children aged 11 to 18 will cover topics such as incel culture, the link between pornography and misogyny, and the dangers posed by AI-generated deepfake content. Now, Sri Lanka is also looking to education reforms. The numbers of gender-based violence offences against children, the sexism, misogyny, teenage pregnancies are on the rise. At the intersection of feminism and education, what nature of reforms must we be urgently looking at?
You've asked a profoundly important question, one that I have been working on for many years, writing about it and speaking about it, including 2 days ago at California University. And for the first time, I think in the history of the CEDAW Committee's constructive dialogues, I raised the issue of the manosphere in my constructive dialogue with Thailand, because Thailand is at the cusp of creating a new Silicon Valley in Southeast Asia. And these technological hubs, as you can imagine, can become soon hubs for the manosphere, for misogyny. And we see that in Silicon Valley, we see that in many areas that are male-dominated. And I've also argued that online misogyny is a reflection and a mirror image of offline misogyny, and that the lines are blurred. And that they bleed into, offline bleeds into online and offline bleeds into online. And this misogyny, the rising misogyny in many countries really needs to be addressed at both levels, online and offline. And the manosphere, as you said, is one, this emerging, rising threat to the manosphere is one that needs to be addressed through our treaty bodies. And I've already started doing it in my constructive dialogue with Thailand, and the ways in which, whether it's the incel culture, whether it is just the ways in which what we see is this anti-feminist rhetoric is being politicized and is being used in many ways as a tool of oppression, both online and offline. So it is important that we are very nuanced and we are very strategic in the ways in which we approach misogyny, both online and offline. So in my constructive dialogue with Fiji a couple of weeks ago, I also addressed the fact that the Vice Chancellor of Fiji's premier national university had been a victim of online violence, and she also happens to be a UN Special Rapporteur. And the ways in which online violence, cyber crimes, continue to deplatform women and silence women, because it is a threat against their visibility, against their leadership, against their voice and the authority that they wield and yield in public life. So it has become one of the greatest impediments to holding women back, to hold women back in political and public life and in any leadership position. So we really need to look at this as a threat against women's leadership in public life. And the ways in which this argument that women are free to leave an online environment that is toxic does not hold water, because it's another way of erasing women and making women disappear from the digital public square. And that is why I think there are so many similarities and analogies between structural forms of violence and internet violence, because both spheres create this idea that women need to leave the public square. And that really is the aim and goal of misogyny.
If we were to look at constitutionalism from a feminist lens, we see a rise in authoritarianism, incel culture, rise in violence against women by men, a bodily autonomy of women being taken away from them, women being excluded from decision-making tables. There is a need now more than ever before, Professor, to have feminist principles woven into constitutional reform processes in order to build more resilient and inclusive democracies. How do we meaningfully go about doing this? Do we teach feminist jurisprudence to our policymakers? What do we do?
Absolutely. So, you probably are very aware that just recently one of the leaders in Silicon Valley came openly to say that we need more masculine energy in Silicon Valley. So you see how dangerous this rhetoric is, especially when we hold these men to very high standards, and these men are those with high authority, both in public life and in the private sector. So, it is a moment that we really need to be to really be careful to ensure that this rhetoric does not continue. And I think this rhetoric is also part of this larger rollback of gender equality and the ways in which women are, women's role in public life is being diminished. So I think you have to see this within that framework, and that is why in all my research, in my publications, I call for more women's leadership in AI development and technological innovation, because of the ways in which that then creates a new culture. that is gender friendly and gender equal. So as long as men, where right now 90% of the top 100 AI companies are led by men, so the corridors of power are singularly male, we are not going to be able to change this culture. And in fact, to Thailand, I said we have to move from this culture of misogyny to a culture of respect. And how can we do that? Yes, so constitutions play a major role. The engagement of women in constitutional drafting, the enshrinement of gender equal provisions in the Constitution and in the entire legislative framework. But it is not only the gender equality, the equal protection provision that we are looking at. Like, for instance, the South African Constitution looks at substantive equality. So it is not only formal equality, but substantive equality, which is once again something that the CEDAW committee has asked Sri Lanka to seriously address. And this is our moment of public reckoning. Substantive equality calls for equality of result, and to have a critical mass of women. In fact, the CEDAW's GR40 calls for parity. Gender parity in all public and private institutions. And so to reach that state of parity, we have to work on substantive equality, including a critical mass of women, including affirmative action for women, and including the ways in which women's political participation needs to be amplified and accelerated through a quota that addresses the history of gender inequality that has created this unequal playing field for women. So it is not only, as I said, to repeat the equal protection provision of the Constitution, but we really need to look at how can we go from formal equality, because there is a strong anti-discrimination provision in our Constitution. It is a strong anti-discrimination provision, but does it cover substantive equality and temporary special measures under Article 4 of the CEDAW, which calls for temporary special measures and which envisions a time that these, because it is temporary, that we will reach parity and we may no longer need it. So I think it's a very nuanced kind of principle that is enshrined in Article 4 of the CEDAW.
I would love your perspective on this. In a world that increasingly looks to be pitted against women and girls, how must we call on women to collectively galvanize their power, empower themselves, and recognize and realize their potential as strong, magical, joyous beings who are not victims?
I love the way you frame it, magical and joyous, citizens of the world, equal citizens of the world. But I also want to, have the opportunity to make a call to action, not only to women, to embrace this beautiful framing that you've just shared with us, but that men need to be part of this movement. And that is the next frontier, the male allies who are champions of women. Because of the ways in which men still dominate most positions of power, it is important that men also share in this, what I think is the cause of our time, gender equality, and as the most important movement for transformative change in the world, and especially at this moment in time where we see threats against gender equality, the rollback of prior gains, that it is the men who must rise to this challenge. It is not only the women. Women have been leaning in for generations. It is the men who have to either lean back so that you give more opportunities for women, or lean in to stand up against injustice. I often quote my own mentor and teacher, Professor Martha Minow at Harvard Law School, who borrows this term upstander. upstander from her student Samantha Power, who was the head of USAID under the Biden administration, where Samantha Power says, if you don't stand up for justice, if you don't stand up when you see injustice, you have taken a position you have taken a position that is anti-justice. So for all men who feel well, staying silent may be an option, I want to say that is not an option. That standing up against injustice, inequality, and unfair treatment is the role of an upstander. And what we need is an upstander, not one who stands outside of the justice system.
Mm-hmm. Professor Rangita de Silva de Alwis, thank you for such an incredible conversation, and thank you for all the work you do.
Thank you, Sonali, for having me, and thank you for this invigorating conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for watching us. We'll see you again next Friday. Good night.